You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 358 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about the U.S. policy on North Korea. I have some updates about the ongoing war in Afghanistan, and then some developing stories in Africa where we have ongoing uprisings in Algeria and Sudan that are now seeing setbacks. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. Best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where you can find this show and my daily news roundup in the right-hand column of the homepage. If you listen to the show a few times and like it, make sure you subscribe to the show somewhere. iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube. It should be up everywhere, and that way you don't miss an episode, because what I do here is update current events and, explain what's going on 3 times a week in the U.S. empire. And then last, if you really like the show and want to really give us a boost, think about donating to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. All right, first up, I have a statement by Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan on North Korea. This I saw was encouraging. Most of everything Patrick Shanahan says seems to be discouraging and hawkish towards me, but on this one it was good. He said there's no reason to restart the military drills between the United States and South Korea. Of course, this is a big step in the U.S.-North Korean relationship, which the U.S. had denied for years, and even the first year of the Trump administration, a freeze for freeze, where the U.S. will stop carrying out its military drills with South Korea, and in exchange, North Korea will end testing of missiles in their nuclear program. Seems like a pretty good deal for everybody, especially on the U.S. side, because then it's slowing North Korea's development of these weapons, and at the same time, military drills could be conducted anywhere. They just, don't have to be conducted along the 38th parallel there, upsetting the North Koreans as much as possible. And so, it seems that Patrick Shanahan making this statement to me kind of symbolizes that the U.S. is willing to stay within that freeze-for-freeze agreement for now. Even though North Korea has carried out some smaller rocket and missile tests, nothing like an ICBM or a nuclear weapon though. Overall, I'm not too, discouraged about the North Korea policy. It seems that for the most part, we've weathered the storm of the Hanoi summit, which went terribly wrong. A catastrophe likely caused by John Bolton, who is, anti-peace, anti-making deals, anti-reducing nuclear weapons on the planet. And, seeing a situation where the U.S. cut a nuclear deal with North Korea, it, just like in Iran, would take war with that country off of the table. So if North Korea doesn't have a nuclear weapons program, then there's no reason at all for the U.S. to be so hawkish against North Korea. And there's, then no reason for a weapon, especially then when you think about, South Korea could really outmatch the North militarily and in terms of wealth and everything like that. If Trump is looking for a major victory heading into the 2020 elections, I think this is a real possibility for him. It seems to me that Kim Jong-un is still more or less incentivized to want to make some kind of deal here. And we still have the great Moon Jae-in as president of South Korea, who's, very committed to trying to achieve some kind of, if not outright, unity and peace deal with the North Koreans, at the very least, increase ties between the two countries. The step I'm really looking for, and I'm really hoping the U.S. decides to take, is to just kind of allow South Korea to start to bypass some of the U.S. sanctions against North Korea and some of the UN sanctions against North Korea to allow more economic transactions between those two countries to start to build a relationship. Now, unfortunately, we have, President Trump, who foolishly believes that this no tolerance, maximum pressure campaign against countries like Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela is what's going to bring them to the table. When in reality, taking small steps like starting to ease some humanitarian sanctions so South Korea could provide more aid to North Korea and they can maybe start to build plants and factories along the DMZ would, go against that maximum pressure campaign, because that's, allowing income to the North Korean state, and then it could last longer. Kim Jong-un will continue to get wealthier, et cetera, et cetera. Donald Trump has never seemed particularly, dedicated to his principles and past statements to me. So I guess the good news is that tomorrow the maximum pressure campaign can be over. He could say it worked, and well, as much as it probably wouldn't be true, nobody really has the first clue on North Korea in the media 90% of the time anyways. So they're all just, saying made up stuff, and, why not have that be true? And I could definitely see it becoming the acceptable narrative. And, that's all Donald Trump, I think, would need to actually go through and sign some kind of deal here with Kim Jong-un. Now, I don't think things are quite as positive as they were before the Hanoi summit still. Like I said, it feels like the storm has been weathered in that, these talks may be completely falling apart isn't going to happen, but there's still, I think, an increased amount of mistrust because, the statements coming out before that Hanoi summit was really that deal could potentially be done here. And then the Americans offered something else that was absolutely unacceptable and had many red lines in it for the North Koreans. All right, I read an interesting article on the South China Sea and that region where you have the U.S. and China increasingly militarizing the area as kind of the great powers competing. Although the Americans say it's, of course, on behalf of the South Koreans and the Vietnamese and the Taiwanese, resisting Chinese oppression, the results are the same. The U.S. sailing our warships throughout this area is provoking China to militarize it more, which means all these other countries are looking to increase their military strength. And so it's, one of these kind of second order problems, but it's important to keep your eye on. I'll link to the article in the show notes page. That way all of you can read it if you want to get some details on, what I'm talking about with the militarization. But Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, and New Zealand have all really ramped up their militaries. Of course, the U.S. has a large military presence, 2,500 troops now in Australia. I discussed recently how they were sent down there and then one of the Americans ended up dying. But I've also talked about, too, how the U.S. is, increasingly selling weapons and developing stronger military ties with, Taiwan. Azerbaijan is one of the countries on the map that I really don't know a whole lot about. But I read this story, and it was just a quick one in Reuters, that said they had canceled a $1 billion contract with Boeing over concerns about safety with the 737 MAX jet. And so, I don't know, this seems like the kind of thing, especially in the Trump administration, to provoke some kind of mercantilist response, either, threatening sanctions or trying to pressure Azerbaijan in another way to buy American-made products. So I think we see this seeping into the American empire foreign policy realm. All right, in Afghanistan, in recent weeks, I've read articles where people have floated the idea of attempting to have another ceasefire in the Afghan war on the 1-year anniversary of, I believe, the first one in, the 18 years or so that war's been going on. The ceasefire was 3 days over a religious holiday, and we got scenes of Taliban members or Afghan army members being able to enter into cities that they otherwise would have been shot for entering. People exchanging pictures and in nice moments. It really showed that, hey, that, the Afghanistan country doesn't have to be so fractured in a war and that people can actually get along. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we'll have a 1-year anniversary ceasefire, but that doesn't mean that there still aren't talks going on between the U.S. and Taliban. The Taliban is also meeting with Russia for talks. And so, this is all positive and encouraging. I think even Germany was looking to, figure out a way to start some talks between the Taliban and the Afghan government. And all these, Western countries or Russia wanting to get involved and try to figure out an end to this thing is what needs to happen because it has to end. I mean, it's just been going on for so long and it's so stupid and there's no mission there. We're just fighting a winless counterinsurgency. The Taliban leader made his yearly statement saying that they will continue to fight until their objectives are met. The Taliban objectives are for foreign forces to leave the country. From my understanding, they haven't caved on that a whole lot, although they have, I guess, made a commitment to, sign an agreement that they would not allow Al-Qaeda or ISIS within their country. Now, a part of this seems problematic to me just because you have the Islamic State Khorasan group, which I don't know how much of an air national jihad organization it is, but nonetheless carries the name of ISIS, and they are jihadists who carry out suicide bombings in Afghanistan. I don't know how capable the Taliban is of just, taking them out all at once, or if, that would be like a more difficult thing kind of do, and how much could they really police their country to keep Al-Qaeda out. Yeah, it seems like a question mark to me, but at the same time, having these commitments and steps seems like the right direction, but it's important to remember, for the Americans, and especially for Mr. Deal of the Century, I'm the greatest deal maker in the world, Donald Trump, thinking that he's going to get a better deal of the Taliban. I don't think it's going to happen. I think they'll just decide to stay and fight. The worst part about it is that the Afghan war is an ongoing bloodbath when it's not U.S. airstrikes taking out civilians, Afghan army soldiers carrying out raids. It's the Taliban and the Islamic State planning suicide bombs and targeting civilian targets. The whole thing is just absolutely horrific. I read a political piece, and I'll link to it in the show notes page, but basically it says that recent statements from Trump and Pompeo have started to temper the enthusiasm of Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law's deal of the century. This was supposed to be a great deal between the Israelis and the Palestinians to finally bring peace. From my understanding, the deal was not going to really offer anything new and cross several known Palestinian red lines. Egypt has came out and made statements saying that there's no way they're signing on to anything that violates Palestinian red lines. And so maybe Pompeo and Trump are reading the writing on the wall and hoping to throw some cold water on this thing before it gets, too out of control and Trump looks like a real failure for not being able to make a deal. Of course, with Trump as president, I think the U.S. is in the worst position to be the mediators of a deal than they ever have been. If you look at that, I regularly hear people bragging about Donald Trump, saying he's the most pro-Israeli president ever. Recognize the Golan Heights as Israeli territory. Move the embassy to Jerusalem. All these are major steps, maybe somewhat symbolic, but at the same time, major steps and major signs to both the Israeli government and the Palestinians that the United States is the Israelis' ally, and they really don't care about getting a fair deal, but just, bringing a situation to, the front that Israel wants. There was a terror attack in Lebanon that killed 2 soldiers and 2 police were killed, and then the terrorist himself blew himself up. I thought it was really interesting that the piece I read on this, I think it was a Reuters Wire piece, they called him a militant and not a terrorist, where in any other sense, if somebody's running around a country, and blowing themselves up, they're definitely a terrorist. And you just see how the treatment of Lebanon is different than, maybe the Sunni countries are a European country. The U.S. carried out military drills in the Arabian Sea with the USS Abraham Lincoln and the Carrier Strike Group, as well as with, I believe, B-52s and 15s. Of course, I'm sure the Iranians see this as a threat, just like the North Koreans perceive it as a threat when the United States and South Korea used to do all those military drills, simulating the invasion and bombing of North Korea. And it certainly, isn't a step towards peace. Turkey puts out a statement saying they've killed 19 Kurdish militants in northern Afghanistan. It looks like these raids not only include airstrikes, but also, putting special operators like on the ground in the mountains of Iraq and, taking out Kurdish positions. Iraq has now sentenced a total of 12 Frenchmen to death for fighting with ISIS. I'll be interested to see if France starts to do more. It definitely seems like from the statements I'm reading that they're still saying, well, we can't do anything about it. Obviously, I think Iraq would actually like to send these guys back to France and let just France deal with them. But because France is unwilling to take them back, there's only so much pressure they could kind of exert on Iraq. But it does seem like, they would rather these men not hang. All right, my updates on Africa here. In Algeria, the election was scheduled for the 4th of July, I guess just by coincidence. And that was supposed to be the time the military leadership of the country gave up their transitional rule of power that they took over in, I believe, February or March, when the 20-something-year president stepped down, at demand of popular protest. The protests have continued on through the military's ruling of the country, and now the military is saying that they're canceling the protests. So, are not canceling the protests, canceling the election that the protesters demanded. So it'll be interesting to see how the story develops from here, what the protesters do. Obviously, they're going to be mad that the elections were canceled, and, what kind of force the military will do to suppress those protests. In Sudan, I believe this is the largest outbreak of violence in the protests that have been going on in that country for several months now, where we reportedly have Sudanese forces, I'm not sure if they're police or, military, enter a camp of protesters. So I guess in Sudan you have a situation where people are going to this city, camping out, and then going to protest every day. And they entered that and they killed at least 30 people. I've, read reports up to 35 now too. So this is a significant escalation of violence, very similar to Algeria, where you have a long-standing president, in this case it's Bashar in Sudan, and he's finally removed after like 30 years of power. during the spring here. And then there's a military council, which they say, it's transitional. We're turning it over. They've had more or less, and they, have allowed the protest leaders to have a little bit of say in talks now, but still doesn't seem like the protesters are getting everything they're asking for. And the military council is clinging to power. This is a real escalation of force here, killing a bunch of protesters. Depending on what we see as an international reaction, from my understanding, the current ruling military council has the support of the Gulf Arab states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt, which I would think would make them tolerable to the United States, but who knows, what the U.S. and what side they'll take on this. I've been really concerned about, more violence breaking out in both Algeria and Sudan in recent months. And it certainly seems that in both these countries now we have a step towards more violence, but, there's also the opportunity to pull it back and to, just encourage more peace for the people to just stand up and say, this is nonviolent. But we have to have a non-military government in these countries. Last story I have today, in the Congo, of course, there's an active Ebola outbreak. I believe it's killed over 1,000 people now. Very interesting to see the lack of media coverage for the Ebola outbreak in the Congo versus the Ebola outbreak in other areas in West Africa, especially because this Ebola outbreak is in a zone where there's active fighting going on between militants and the government. In fact, we had the Sudanese government saying that they just killed 26 militants in one of these Ebola zones. So it's absolutely crazy what's going on in the Congo right now with, these Ebola facilities being raided by either mobs of misunderstanding people or militants, and then fighting going on in these regions that, could really spread a very deadly disease, and more attention should be paid to this. And hopefully that means either ways to negotiate peace, having more people go to the region, even to spread knowledge and say like, hey, this Ebola thing is a real thing. I know, in the past, the colonial powers have probably really looked to undermine and steal from you. But this time their doctors are actually doctors just trying to prevent the spread of a very dangerous virus. All right, guys, if you can't tell from my voice, I'm still feeling not so well from the allergies here. Allergy season is not agreeing with me and is not helping my fight against the empire. So I'm going to cut a little short again today. Hopefully on Friday's show, I'll have a little bit more. I think I'm having Will back on, and so he could carry a little bit of the load while I'm sneezing over here. But I appreciate everybody. I appreciate your support. I appreciate sharing the show. As always, if there's anything that you want to hear me talk about, let me know. Twitter, I'm at KYAAALE. I think that's the way I like to communicate with people most of the time online these days. Make sure you share the show. Go to the Libertarian Institute, where you can find all my work and a bunch of other great libertarian content, including the great Pete Mansrader Raymond, who was just booted off of Twitter for some ridiculous stuff. So as much as I use Twitter and like it, the company itself is not so great. And, what they did to Mance, Pete there, not so fair. But anyways, you listen to everything he has to say at the Libertarian Institute. And thanks, everybody.